Existentialism and feminism are two closely interwoven topics. They both deal with overcoming isolation and finding personal freedom, but they approach them from different angles. Existentialism primarily deals with struggling to find meaning within one's own existence. One of the main tenets of existentialism is isolation, which basically refers to the limitations that humans face in their search for personal freedom. Someone can be isolated through societal values, personal relationships, or even by their own mindset. Jean-Paul Sartre was an existential philosopher who wrote extensively on isolation, and he theorizes that life can only have meaning if someone overcomes isolation and values their inherent freedom. What they do with that freedom is irrelevant. The only important thing is that by obtaining freedom, someone can give meaning to their life in a world that otherwise has no meaning. In other words, what Sartre is trying to say is that having a choice to do something is more important than what choice you actually make. Feminism, on the other hand, pulls a lot of its basic tenets from beliefs of inclusion and connectivity rather than isolation. A main belief in feminist critical theory is the idea of agency over objectivity, which means that women should gain control of their own lives and choices rather than be objects to be acted upon by men. However, women who seek to become existentialists must be feminists first and foremost. Existentialism has been a boys' club for a long time, and women have had to fight their way in for their opinions to be validated. Simone de Beauvoir, one of the first female existentialists, said herself that the very struggle to get her counterparts to see her as an equal is a struggle that women must face in their boundary to become transcendent. This extra requirement for women to become existentialists stems from traditional gender roles, which tend to pin women down to obligations such as marriage and motherhood. Men are unaffected by these things and therefore can become existentialists a lot more easily. This male privilege is another important topic that feminism covers. It basically refers to the choices and experiences that men are able to have rather than women solely because of gender. This is a really important topic that's evident when we compare both The Catcher in the Rye and Wild.
Our thesis focuses on the critical literary theories of existentialism and feminism, in which we address the lack of representation of females in the existentialist canon and examine the reasons behind this. Through analysis of The Catcher in the Rye, we seek to use this text as an example to represent the standards and the tendencies of the male-dominated existentialist canon. In contrast, our pop culture selection, the recent motion picture Wild, serves to illustrate the unconventionality of a female seeking questions of her identity and existence. The comparison of the two works illustrates the freedoms that men have in existential philosophy and the limitations that women face due to traditional gender roles. We also will compare certain traits of Holden Caulfield and those of Cheryl Strayed, the protagonist in our contemporary example Wild.
The novel The Catcher in the Rye is a prime example of existentialist ideas and a lack of feminist ideas in literature. U.S. historical events often influence the popular literature of the times. The confidences and fears of the nation are reflected in the text. As America rose in power, the male patriarchy took control over the social order. With this patriarchy came a swarm of anti-feminist beliefs that would influence the culture in America. The Catcher in the Rye demonstrates post-World War II fears and establishes itself as an existentialist novel, while affirming the lack of female protagonists and existentialists in American literature. Isolation is a main theme in existential philosophy. Holden isolates himself physically and mentally from those around him. Holden often refers to everyone around him at Pensy as phonies, and this serves as a means of isolation of his character from those around him. He mentally categorizes himself differently than these phonies. The categorization of those around him as phonies follows him into his excursion to New York City, where the phonies exist all around him. Holden also mentally isolates himself from his family, believing that he is inferior to the rest of his siblings. Holden removes himself from the world and seeks freedom from his obligations. He literally isolates himself from his family atmosphere and does not contact them, apart from contacting his sister Phoebe, over the duration of the novel. He seeks freedom from his familial and worldly obligations. Holden has a preoccupation with the ducks in Central Park. He wonders where they go in the winter when the lake freezes over, and fixates on that thought multiple times. This fixation represents his craving for escape in his own life. The ducks can come and go as they wish, but Holden feels trapped in the world, surrounded by phonies, seemingly without a way to free himself. There is an added pressure on women to fulfill their societal duties that can add to the possibly difficult process of becoming an existentialist. Women are expected to have and raise children and to be loving wives before doing anything else. The existential field is dominated by men, and even though it revolves around a basic human quest for identity, and truth that should seemingly be uninfluenced by gender. The Catcher in the Rye has a noticeable lack of feminist values. The main character is a white male with many privileges. He drops out of a renowned boarding school to indulge in underage drinking and an unplanned excursion through the city of New York, and is only able to do so because he is a man. He was given these freedoms because of his gender, and although he doesn't acknowledge their value, he still uses them for his own purpose. Modern American literature has a stark lack of female characters exemplifying existential ideals. So many women are pigeonholed into the traditional gender roles and are not even given the freedom to explore themselves in their environment. This environment is both literal and metaphorical, and in a literal way, women in traditional gender roles were often expected to be homemakers. This is a literal confinement of the person and their consciousness. In a metaphorical way, it could be the lack of opportunity, encouragement, or freedom for women to explore their characters and identity that inhibits them from going on an existential journey. None of the female characters in the novel The Catcher in the Rye act with any agency. At one point in the novel, Holden implores his female interest to run away with him and start a new life. Sally vehemently refuses because most likely she can't even imagine having that kind of freedom. Women have been conditioned by gender roles to be distracted from personal freedom by the practical nature of the lives that they are told to adhere to. The oppression of female freedom is a popular theme in American history, and The Catcher in the Rye is a novel that well exemplifies that oppression. Holden objectifies all but one woman in the novel. He does not devalue his sister Phoebe and does not objectify her. In keeping with his habits of objectification, Holden often only describes women by their physical attributes. In addition to this, there are no obviously redeeming female characters apart from Phoebe, and even she is not given the proper opportunity or guidance to even begin an existential journey. Most other female characters are cast in a generally negative light because Holden doesn't seem to respect them. What seals the lack of feminist themes is the fact that Holden sees all of these actions as acceptable because of the patriarchal and anti-feminist society he was raised in. His culture glorifies male heroes and categorizes women as in need of help from men. Holden Caulfield holds a level of privilege that he does not seem to appreciate. He is a rich, white man and has access to opportunities that many people, especially women, do not have. The Catcher in the Rye shows Holden utilizing his male privilege throughout the novel. He does not acknowledge or appreciate this privilege because it is so normalized to him. Holden wants the idea of freedom, but does not actually use it in a useful way. At one point in the novel, Holden invites a prostitute to his room but backs out of the whole ordeal. This instance is a great example of Sartre's theory that actually having freedom is more important than what you do with that freedom. The Catcher in the Rye is a prime example of an existentialist novel, but it falls short in being a novel with feminist values.
While Catcher in the Rye helps to illustrate the conventional application of existential theory to literature, Wilde serves as the exception to the canon, illustrating the stark difference between the theory as is traditionally applied and how the theory is applied to the lives of females. Due to societal norms of our patriarchal culture, two main hindrances exist for women seeking to be existentialists. First and foremost, women must adopt feminist ideologies in order for their existence to be validated. In other words, they must be able to find meaning in parts of their identity outside of the roles of wives and mothers. The second obstacle that female existentialists face is that they encounter isolationism in different ways than men, and therefore do not necessarily relate to the multitude of male role models in existentialist canon. In Wilde, Cheryl Strayed hikes the entirety of the Pacific Crest Trail in a journey for meaning following her mother's death, divorce from her husband, and a history of drug abuse. Cheryl's existential journey stems from her lifestyle choice to live as a feminist and to act with agency. By choosing to be unrestricted to the traditional female gender roles, Cheryl gives herself the freedom to evaluate her own personal needs rather than believing that her only importance is relegated to the domestic sphere. Without her assertion of her belief in feminism, Cheryl would not be able to partake in her search for identity. Isolation is the main tactic Cheryl uses in seeking her existential value in both a literal and metaphoric sense. By walking the Pacific Crest Trail alone, Cheryl faces geographic isolation in the most literal sense of the word. This allows her to disassociate herself from the distractions of the modern age, leaving her alone in nature to focus on the introspective self-evaluation that she needs. Metaphorically, Cheryl leaves behind the troubling aspects of her past and is able to ruminate on her mistakes from an outside perspective in order to find the meaning of her life. By depicting the complex set of problems of the everyday woman, such as identity, familial conflict, and the threat of sexual abuse, Cheryl serves as the ideal female role model that, for the most part, does not exist in the single-faceted portrayal of women in the media. Even though the majority of women do not find themselves isolated in the wilderness, as Cheryl does, her experiences continue to relate to the norms of life as a woman, even more so than the plethora of stories about males in the existentialist canon. All in all, although Wilde is one of the few exceptions to the male-dominated genre, it is a significant step to bridging the gap between existentialism and the women the philosophy has ignored for so long.
The principles of existentialism are fairly egalitarian. Overcome isolation, find personal freedom, and accept that freedom as a part of your life. However, women have been excluded from the existential realm for years because they feel the burden of marriages, motherhood, and other social pressures. These roles are not evil in any way, but by being just a wife or just a mother, women can easily restrict themselves and strip themselves from the very basic human freedoms that they so rightly deserve. Women have pushed aside their freedom for years and therefore have very little exposure to existential philosophy. Moreover, there is not a lot of existential literature that focuses on how existential principles apply to women. While The Catcher in the Rye is one of the most famous American existential literature pieces of its time, the plot focuses on around one male, Holden Caulfield, and his search for meaning in his life. The novel itself has very limited positive female representation, and the characters who are portrayed positively, such as Holden's sister Phoebe, never get a chance to apply existential principles to their own lives, but rather serve as backup for Holden on his own quest. Many of the experiences that Holden is able to have in New York, getting drunk in bars alone or calling a prostitute just to chat, for example, are available to him solely because of his inherent male privilege, and he doesn't even realize it. Realistically, it would be a lot more difficult and a lot more dangerous for women to embark on the same kind of existential journey that Holden embarked on. Because they get virtually no representation, women have a hard time connecting to existential principles. This is where feminism comes in. Because of its promotion of agency over objectivity, women can gain control over their own lives and use existentialism to work towards personal liberation. Wilde is unique in that it manages to combine feminist and existential principles, something that Hollywood and pop culture in general rarely tends to do. With Wilde, girls finally have a realistic role model that embodies what it means to be both a feminist and an existentialist. Cheryl Strayed is not Holden Caulfield, and for girls like us, that's a good thing. In a world full of rom-coms and damsels in distress, Wilde provides female role models who aren't perfect, who don't have to get the guy, and who, despite obstacles far and wide, find freedom in themselves.